The desert wind carried sand through every crack in the plywood chapel walls, a persistent whisper that never stopped. Chaplain David Hayes stood at the small wooden altar, arranging hymnals that no one would use. The morning light filtered through gaps in the corrugated metal roof, casting strips of gold across the rough concrete floor. This was Forward Operating Base Sentinel, 50 miles from anything resembling civilization, and the chapel was little more than a shipping container with a cross nailed to the door. David had been here for 6 months. 6 months of empty pews, of soldiers who nodded politely but never came back, of feeling like the loneliest man in a place filled with 300 people. He was 38 years old, soft-spoken, with graying hair at his temples and hands that had never held a weapon in combat. He wore the same dusty uniform as everyone else, but his collar bore the insignia of a chaplain, a symbol that seemed to inspire more discomfort than comfort. Behind him, the door slammed open. Major Eric Brennan strode in, his boots heavy on the floor, his jaw set in its usual expression of barely contained contempt. Brennan was the executive officer of the base, second in command, and he carried himself like a man who had been passed over for promotion too many times. He was broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and had a voice that could strip paint. "Chaplain," Brennan said, the word dripping with disdain, "I need this space cleared by 1300 hours. We're using it for storage, ammunition crates." David turned slowly, his expression calm. "Major, this is a designated worship space. Regulations require—" "I don't care what regulations require," Brennan interrupted. "I care about operational efficiency. We're short on secure storage, and this building is sitting empty 99% of the time. You can hold your little prayer meetings in a tent." David felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of being dismissed before he even finished speaking. "Sir, this chapel serves an important function for the mental and spiritual health of the troops. I respectfully request that we find another solution." Brennan stepped closer, his face inches from David's. "You respectfully request? Let me tell you something, Chaplain. You're dead weight. You don't carry a rifle. You don't contribute to mission success. You just wander around asking people about their feelings. This is a combat zone, not a therapy session." David held Brennan's gaze, refusing to look away. "My role is to provide spiritual support, Major. That's my contribution, and it's protected by military law." Brennan smirked, a cold, ugly expression. "Protected? Right. Well, let's see how protected you feel when I reassign you to sanitation duty. How about you spend your days cleaning latrines instead of pretending to be useful?" Before David could respond, Brennan turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the door swinging in the wind. David stood alone in the chapel, his hands trembling slightly. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath, whispering a prayer under his breath, not for himself, for patience, for strength, for the grace to endure men like Eric Brennan. Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the desert heat began to build. The war continued, indifferent to the small battles fought in the shadows. Part 2. The Weight of Contempt. The mess hall was a chaos of noise and movement. 200 soldiers filled the long tables, eating quickly, talking loudly, the air thick with the smell of reconstituted eggs and burnt coffee. David sat alone at the far end of a table, eating slowly, a worn paperback open beside his tray. He had learned not to expect company. Soldiers avoided him the way they avoided bad luck. A group of junior officers sat 2 tables over. One of them, Lieutenant Marcus Gray, glanced at David and said something that made the others laugh. David didn't look up. He had heard it all before. The jokes about the chaplain who couldn't fight. The chaplain who was basically a glorified hall monitor. The chaplain who was taking up space that could go to someone useful. "Hey, Chaplain." David looked up. Gray was standing now, grinning, his friends watching with anticipation. Gray was young, cocky, and had been deployed for only 3 months. He still thought war was a game you could win with attitude. "Yes, Lieutenant." "I got a question for you," Gray said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "If God is all-powerful, why does he need you to speak for him? Can't he just send an email?" Laughter erupted. David closed his book and met Gray's eyes calmly. "That's a fair question, Lieutenant. The short answer is that God doesn't need me, but people sometimes need someone to listen. If you ever want to talk, my door is always open." Gray's grin faltered slightly. He hadn't expected sincerity. "Yeah, well, I'm good. I talk to my rifle, it's more reliable." More laughter. David nodded and returned to his meal. He had learned that responding with anger only fed the fire, but the isolation was wearing on him. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. That afternoon, David was summoned to Major Brennan's office. The office was a cramped plywood box with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a calendar marked with red X's counting down the days until rotation home. Brennan sat behind the desk, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Sit," Brennan said. David sat. "I've been reviewing personnel assignments," Brennan began, tapping a pen against a folder. "And I've decided to reassign you. Effective immediately, you'll be assisting with supply inventory and waste management. Your chapel duties will be secondary." David's jaw tightened. "Major, that's a violation of my role as a chaplain. I'm non-combatant clergy, and my duties are specifically outlined." "I'm aware of what your duties are," Brennan snapped. "But I'm also aware that you're under my command, and I decide how personnel are utilized. If you have a problem with that, take it up with Colonel Sanders." David knew that was a dead end. Colonel Sanders was a field officer who cared about mission results, not chaplaincy disputes. "Sir, I respectfully ask that you reconsider." Brennan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Let me make something very clear, Chaplain. I don't respect you. I don't respect your position. And I don't believe you belong here. You're a liability, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." David stood slowly, his face calm but his hands clenched at his sides. "I'm here to serve, Major, just like you." "No," Brennan said, standing as well. "You're here to make yourself feel important. Now get out." David left the office, the door slamming behind him. He walked across the dusty compound, past the armory, past the motor pool until he reached the chapel. Inside, he knelt at the altar and closed his eyes. He prayed for Brennan. He prayed for Gray. He prayed for the strength to continue serving, even when no one wanted him to. The desert wind howled outside, and the chapel walls creaked under the weight of the heat. David remained kneeling, his faith the only weapon he had left. Part 3. The Quiet Resistance. The days that followed were a relentless grind. David spent his mornings scrubbing latrines, his afternoons cataloging supply crates in the suffocating heat of the storage tents, and his evenings trying to maintain the chapel that no one visited. Major Brennan had made good on his threat. David's duties as a chaplain had been buried under a mountain of menial labor, and every soldier on the base knew it. The humiliation was intentional. Brennan made sure David was assigned the dirtiest, most degrading tasks. When a sewage line backed up, David was called. When the trash incinerator needed cleaning, David was there. The message was clear: this is what you're worth. But David refused to break. He showed up on time, did the work without complaint, and still kept the chapel open every evening, even if no one came. He moved through the base like a ghost, silent and steady, his presence a quiet rebuke to Brennan's cruelty. One afternoon, while David was hauling garbage bags to the incinerator, a young private approached him. Private Emily Chen was barely 20 years old, a communications specialist with dark circles under her eyes and a haunted look that David recognized immediately. She glanced around nervously before speaking. "Chaplain Hayes." David set down the bags and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Yes, Private. I heard you do counseling. Is that true?" "It is," David said gently. "Would you like to talk?" Emily nodded quickly, tears welling in her eyes. "Not here. Can I come to the chapel tonight?" "Of course, any time." She left quickly, and David returned to his work, his heart heavy. He knew what that look meant. He had seen it on too many faces. The war was eating her alive from the inside. That evening, Emily came to the chapel. She sat in the front pew, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and told David everything. She told him about the nightmares, about the guilt of watching a convoy get hit and not being able to help, about the way her hands shook whenever she heard a loud noise. She told him she was afraid she was losing her mind. David listened. He didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. He just listened, and when she was done, he told her the truth. What she was feeling was real, it was valid, and she didn't have to carry it alone. They prayed together, and when she left, she looked lighter, as if some of the weight had been lifted. But Emily wasn't alone in her struggles. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more soldiers came to the chapel: a sergeant who couldn't sleep, a corporal who was drinking too much, a specialist who was planning to hurt himself. They came quietly after dark when no one would see them, and David met them there every time, no matter how exhausted he was from Brennan's punishments. Word began to spread quietly among the soldiers who needed help. The chaplain was still there. The chaplain was listening. Brennan noticed. He noticed the soldiers slipping into the chapel at night. He noticed that David's influence, small as it was growing, and it infuriated him. One morning, Brennan called David into his office again. This time, his expression was darker, more dangerous. "I hear you've been holding unauthorized counseling sessions," Brennan said coldly. "I've been providing spiritual support, as is my duty," David replied calmly. "You're undermining morale," Brennan snapped. "You're making soldiers think they're broken. You're making them weak." David met Brennan's gaze. "With respect, Major, acknowledging pain doesn't make someone weak. It makes them human." Brennan's face flushed with anger. "You're done, Hayes. I'm filing a formal complaint with command. I'm going to have you removed from this base." David didn't flinch. "Do what you feel you must, Major, but I'm not going anywhere until I'm ordered to." Brennan leaned across the desk, his voice a low growl. "You think you're some kind of saint, don't you? You think you're better than the rest of us because you carry a Bible instead of a rifle. But when the bullets start flying, Chaplain, you're going to be the first one begging for someone else to save you." David stood, his voice quiet but firm. "I hope I never have to find out, Major, but if that day comes, I'll be ready." He walked out, leaving Brennan seething in his office. The war outside the walls was brutal, but the war inside the base was just beginning. And David Hayes, the man everyone called weak, was refusing to surrender. Part 4: The line crossed. The attack came without warning. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of suffocating desert heat that made every movement feel like wadding through syrup. David was in the supply tent, checking inventory logs, when the first explosion shook the ground. The sound was a deep, concussive boom that rattled his teeth and sent dust cascading from the ceiling. Alarms blared across the base, a piercing wail that cut through the shock. David dropped the clipboard and ran outside. Smoke was rising from the eastern perimeter, thick and black, curling into the sky. Soldiers were sprinting toward their posts, grabbing weapons, shouting orders. The base was under attack. Mortar rounds began to fall. The insurgents had positioned themselves on the ridgeline, using the high ground to rain fire down on the base. Each explosion sent shrapnel and dirt flying, and the soldiers scrambled to return fire from the bunkers and gun emplacements. It was chaos. David ran toward the medical tent, his instinct to help overpowering any sense of self-preservation. Wounded soldiers were already being carried in, some on stretchers, others limping, their faces pale with shock. The medics were overwhelmed. "Chaplain," one of the medics, Sergeant Rachel Moore, waved him over. "We need hands, can you help?" "Tell me what to do," David said, rolling up his sleeves. For the next hour, David worked beside the medics. He held IVs, applied pressure to wounds, and whispered prayers over soldiers who were too broken to speak. He didn't think about the mortars falling outside. He didn't think about Brennan or the humiliation or the trash duty. He just worked. Then the power went out. The generator that supplied the medical tent failed, plunging the space into semi-darkness. The backup lights flickered on, but they were weak, casting long shadows. Sergeant Moore cursed under her breath. "We need that generator back online. Now." David knew where the generator was. It was in a shed near the eastern perimeter, the same area that was taking the heaviest fire. He looked at Moore, then at the wounded soldiers on the tables. "I'll go," he said. "Are you insane?" Moore snapped. "You'll get yourself killed." "If we don't get power, they'll die," David replied, nodding toward the soldiers. "I can move fast. I'll be fine." Before she could argue, David was out the door. He ran low, his heart pounding, his breath ragged. Mortar rounds were still falling, each one a thunderclap that made his ears ring. He reached the generator shed and threw open the door. The diesel engine had stalled. David's hands shook as he worked the manual restart, pulling the cord again and again. Finally, the engine roared to life. The lights in the medical tent flickered back on. David turned to run back, but a mortar round hit just 20 yards away. The blast threw him to the ground, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. He tasted blood. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. Then he forced himself to his feet and stumbled back toward the medical tent. When he staggered inside, covered in dust and blood, Sergeant Moore stared at him in disbelief. "You're insane, Chaplain." David managed a weak smile. "I've been called worse." The attack lasted another 2 hours before the insurgents retreated. When the all-clear finally sounded, the base was left battered but standing. 12 soldiers were wounded, 2 critically, but no one had died. That night David sat alone in the chapel, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. The door opened, and Private Emily Chen stepped inside. She walked up to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." David looked up at her, exhausted. "I didn't do anything." "You ran into fire to save us," Emily said. "That's not nothing." As she left, David closed his eyes and prayed, not for recognition, not for vindication, just for the strength to keep going, because he knew the hardest battle was still ahead. Part 5: The Evidence Gathers. The days following the attack were marked by a fragile tension. The base was on high alert, patrols doubled, and every soldier walked with their rifles slung tight across their chest. But something had shifted. The way soldiers looked at Chaplain David Hayes had changed. They no longer avoided his eyes in the mess hall. Some even nodded as they passed him on the dusty paths between buildings. David had not sought recognition for running to the generator under fire, but word had spread anyway. Soldiers talked. They always did. And now the chaplain who had been treated like dead weight was being quietly reassessed. Major Eric Brennan, however, was not reassessing anything. If anything, his contempt had calcified into something darker. He saw the small shift in morale, the way soldiers now spoke to David with something approaching respect, and it infuriated him. In Brennan's mind, the chaplain was still a parasite, and the fact that others were starting to see him differently felt like a personal betrayal. 2 days after the attack, David received an unusual request. Sergeant Rachel Moore, the senior medic, came to the chapel and asked if they could talk privately. She carried a folder under her arm and her expression was grim. "What's wrong?" David asked, gesturing for her to sit. Rachel hesitated, then placed the folder on the table between them. "I need you to see something, Chaplain. It's about the attack." David opened the folder. Inside were medical logs, supply requisitions, and communication records from the day of the assault. Rachel pointed to a specific entry dated 3 days before the attack. "This is a request I filed for additional medical supplies," Rachel explained. "Morphine saline bandages. We were running critically low. I flagged it as urgent." David scanned the document, and it was denied, Rachel said quietly, by Major Brennan. David looked up sharply. Denied? Why? He said it wasn't a priority. He said we could make do with what we had. Rachel's voice was tight with anger. But that's not all. Look at this. She pulled out another document, this one a communication log. It showed a warning from intelligence officers at a higher command post. The warning indicated increased enemy activity in the region and recommended heightened defensive measures and supply stockpiling. This warning was sent to Brennan 4 days before the attack, Rachel said. He acknowledged receipt, but he didn't act on it. He didn't reinforce our defenses. He didn't stockpile supplies. He did nothing. David felt a cold weight settle in his chest. You're saying he ignored intelligence that could have prevented casualties? I'm saying that during the attack, we ran out of critical supplies because Brennan denied my request, Rachel said, her voice breaking. Private Collins almost died because we didn't have enough saline to keep him stable. If you hadn't gotten that generator running, we would have lost him. David closed the folder, his mind racing. This wasn't just negligence. This was a failure of leadership that had put lives at risk. Why are you showing me this? Rachel looked him in the eye. Because no one else will listen. I tried to bring it up with Colonel Sanders, but Brennan intercepted it. He told me to drop it, said I was being insubordinate. He's untouchable, Chaplain, unless someone with credibility backs me up. David understood. He was not a combatant. He carried no rank that could intimidate Brennan. But he was a commissioned officer, a chaplain, and his reports carried a certain weight, especially in matters of morale and welfare. What do you need from me? David asked. I need you to file a formal report, Rachel said. Document what you saw during the attack. Document the supply shortages. And document the fact that Brennan's decisions put soldiers at risk. David nodded slowly. I'll do it. Over the next 3 days, David worked quietly. He spoke to soldiers who had been on duty during the attack. He reviewed supply logs and communication records. He documented everything with the meticulous care of a man who knew he was walking into a minefield. He also prayed. He prayed for wisdom, for courage, and for protection from the retaliation he knew was coming. Because Major Eric Brennan was not a man who forgave challenges to his authority. When the report was finished, David submitted it through official channels, copying Colonel Sanders and the base chaplain coordinator at Regional Command. The report was clinical, factual, and devastating. It outlined Brennan's denial of critical supplies, his failure to act on intelligence warnings, and the direct impact those failures had on the medical response during the attack. David sealed the envelope and handed it to the communications officer for transmission. As he walked back to the chapel, he felt the weight of what he had done settle on his shoulders. He had crossed a line. He had challenged power. And now the real battle would begin. Part 6, The Reckoning Begins. The summons came the next morning. David was in the middle of leading a small memorial service for a soldier who had died in a vehicle accident when a runner arrived with a terse message. Report to Colonel Sanders' office immediately. David finished the service, said a final prayer, and walked across the compound. The sun was already brutal, the heat shimmering off the metal roofs of the buildings. Soldiers watched him pass, their expressions unreadable. Word had spread that the chaplain had filed a report against Major Brennan. The base was waiting to see what would happen next. Colonel Thomas Sanders' office was larger than Brennan's, with a desk cluttered with maps, reports, and a framed photo of his family back home. Sanders was in his 50s, a career officer with a weathered face and the calm authority of a man who had seen everything. He was sitting behind his desk when David entered, and Major Brennan was standing beside him, his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold fury. Chaplain Hayes, Sanders said, his voice neutral, sit. David sat. Brennan remained standing, looming over him like a predator. Sanders tapped the report on his desk. I've read your submission. It's detailed. It's also explosive. You're accusing Major Brennan of negligence that endangered lives. I'm documenting what happened, sir, David said calmly. The facts are in the report. Brennan stepped forward, his voice sharp. The facts. The facts are that you're a disgruntled chaplain who has no understanding of operational command. You're twisting a tragic situation to settle a personal grudge. David met Brennan's gaze. I have no grudge, Major. I have a duty to report when I see something that puts soldiers at risk. You're a coward, Brennan spat. You hid behind your collar for months, and now you're trying to play hero by throwing me under the bus. Enough, Sanders said, his voice cutting through the tension. He looked at David. Chaplain, these are serious allegations. If they're true, there will be consequences. If they're false, there will be consequences for you. Are you prepared to stand by this report? David didn't hesitate. Yes, sir. Sanders nodded slowly. I've requested an investigation. An inspector general team will arrive within the week to review the incident, the supply logs, and the intelligence warnings. Until then, Major Brennan, you will continue your duties, and Chaplain Hayes, you will remain available for questioning. Brennan's jaw clenched. This is absurd. You're entertaining the delusions of a man who has contributed nothing to this base. Sanders turned to Brennan, his expression hardening. That's enough, Major. Dismissed. Brennan shot David a look of pure hatred before turning and storming out of the office. The door slammed behind him. Sanders waited until the sound of Brennan's footsteps faded, then looked at David. You've made a powerful enemy, Chaplain. I know, sir. Was it worth it? David thought of Private Collins, pale and shaking on the medical table. He thought of Sergeant Moore's desperate hands trying to stop the bleeding with inadequate supplies. He thought of the soldiers who had trusted leadership to keep them safe. Yes, sir, David said quietly. It was worth it. Sanders nodded. Then I suggest you keep your head down until the investigators arrive. And Chaplain, watch your back. David left the office, the desert sun blinding after the dim interior. He walked back to the chapel, every step feeling heavier than the last. He knew Brennan wouldn't wait for the investigators. He knew retaliation was coming. But for the first time in months, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not for himself, but for the soldiers who deserved better. And that hope was worth any price. Part 7, The Final Stand. The night before the Inspector General team arrived, the base was unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of generators and distant patrols seemed muted, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. David sat alone in the chapel, the dim light of a single lantern casting long shadows across the wooden pews. He was reading from a worn Bible, trying to steady his thoughts, when the door creaked open. Major Eric Brennan stepped inside. He was not in uniform. He wore civilian clothes, dark and rumpled, and his face was haggard, the face of a man who had been drinking and thinking too much. He closed the door behind him with deliberate slowness and stood there, staring at David. Chaplain, Brennan said, his voice low and dangerous. We need to talk. David closed the Bible and stood. Major, if you're here to threaten me. Threaten you? Brennan laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. No, Hayes, I'm here to offer you a chance to save your career and mine. David remained silent, waiting. Brennan stepped closer. Withdraw the report. Tell the investigators it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you made a mistake. Do that, and I'll make sure you're transferred to a cushy post stateside. Chapel duty in some quiet base where you can pray all day and never have to worry about mortars or supply shortages or anything real. David shook his head slowly. I can't do that, Major. Can't or won't? Both. Brennan's face darkened. You self-righteous fool. Do you really think they're going to side with you? You're a chaplain, you're nothing. I'm a decorated officer with 20 years of service. They'll bury you. Maybe, David said quietly, but that doesn't change what happened. Soldiers were put at risk because you prioritized pride over preparedness. I can't ignore that." Brennan's hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand what it's like. The pressure, the impossible decisions. You sit in your chapel and judge, but you've never had to make the calls I have to make." "You're right," David said. "I've never had to make those calls, but I've had to sit with the soldiers who suffered because of them. I've held their hands while they bled. I've prayed over them while they wondered if they were going to die. So yes, Major, I judge. And I stand by my report." Brennan stared at him, his face contorted with rage and something deeper, fear. Then he turned and walked out without another word, leaving the door swinging in the night air. The Inspector General team arrived at dawn. They were 3 officers, professional and detached, carrying briefcases and recording equipment. They set up in a conference room and began their work systematically, interviewing soldiers, reviewing logs, and examining the evidence. David testified first. He spoke calmly, presenting the facts without emotion, answering every question with precision. When they asked him why he had waited to file the report, he told them the truth. He had needed to gather the evidence and ensure it was airtight. When they asked if he had any personal animosity toward Major Brennan, he said yes, but that his animosity was rooted in Brennan's actions, not prejudice. Sergeant Rachel Moore testified next. She presented the medical logs, the denied supply requests, and the communication warnings. Her testimony was damning. She described in clinical detail how the shortages had nearly cost lives, and how the failure to act on intelligence had left them unprepared. Other soldiers were called. Private Emily Chen testified about the morale on the base, about the way Brennan's treatment of the chaplain had created a culture of fear and contempt. Lieutenant Marcus Gray, the young officer who had mocked David in the mess hall, testified reluctantly but truthfully about Brennan's disregard for chaplain services and his open disdain for non-combatant personnel. By the afternoon of the second day, the investigators had what they needed. Colonel Sanders was called in for a final briefing. David was not present, but he heard the outcome later from Sergeant Moore. The Inspector General's conclusion was clear. Major Eric Brennan had failed in his duties as executive officer. He had ignored intelligence warnings, denied critical supply requests, and created a hostile environment that undermined unit cohesion. The recommendation was immediate relief from command and a formal reprimand that would end any hope of promotion. Brennan was summoned to Colonel Sanders' office. David did not witness the meeting, but he saw Brennan leave an hour later, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. The man who had strutted across the base like a conqueror now walked like a ghost. That evening, David stood outside the chapel, watching the sun set over the desert. Sergeant Moore approached him, a small smile on her face. "It's done," she said. "Brennan's being transferred. The investigation found him at fault." David nodded slowly. "Good. You did this, Chaplain. You stood up when no one else would." David shook his head. "I just told the truth. The rest was out of my hands." Moore looked at him for a long moment. "You know, a lot of us didn't think you belonged here. We thought you were just taking up space. But you proved us wrong. You're tougher than any of us gave you credit for." David smiled faintly. "I'm not tough, Sergeant, I'm just stubborn." She laughed, then walked away, leaving David alone under the darkening sky. He felt no triumph, no vindication. He felt only a quiet relief that justice had been done and that soldiers would be safer because of it. Inside the chapel, the lantern still burned, a small light in the vast desert darkness, and Chaplain David Hayes, the man they had called weak, stood tall. Part 8, The Light Remains. 3 weeks after Major Eric Brennan's departure, forward operating Base Sentinel settled into a new rhythm. The tension that had permeated the compound for months slowly dissipated, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. The soldiers moved with a little more ease. their interactions with each other softened by the knowledge that someone had finally stood up to the toxic leadership that had poisoned morale. David Hayes remained the chaplain, but his role had changed in the eyes of the soldiers. The chapel was no longer empty. Soldiers came, not in droves but in a steady trickle. They came alone, in pairs, sometimes in small groups. They came to talk, to pray, or simply to sit in the quiet space that David had fought so hard to preserve. Private Emily Chen came every Sunday, bringing a small group of communications specialists with her. Sergeant Rachel Moore stopped by after her shifts to debrief emotionally and to pray for the wounded. Even Lieutenant Marcus Gray, the young officer who had mocked David in the mess hall, showed up one evening with a sheepish expression and an apology. "I was wrong about you, Chaplain," Gray said, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the chapel. "I thought you were just soft. I didn't understand what strength looked like." David smiled and gestured for him to sit. "Strength comes in many forms, Lieutenant. You don't have to carry a rifle to be strong." Gray nodded slowly, then asked the question David knew was coming. "How did you do it? How did you stand up to Brennan when everyone else was too afraid?" David thought for a moment, then said, "I didn't do it because I was brave. I did it because it was right. And sometimes doing the right thing is all the strength you need." Gray left that night with something in his eyes that looked like respect. Colonel Sanders called David into his office one afternoon. The colonel was sitting behind his desk, reviewing paperwork when David entered. Sanders looked up and gestured for him to sit. "Chaplain Hayes," Sanders began, his tone formal but not unkind. "I've been instructed by Regional Command to commend you for your actions during the attack and for your integrity in reporting the failures in leadership." David shook his head. "I don't need a commendation, sir. I just want to do my job." Sanders smiled faintly. "I figured you'd say that, but I'm giving you one anyway. You earned it." He slid a document across the desk. It was an official commendation letter, signed by the commanding general of the region. David glanced at it, then set it aside. "There's something else," Sanders continued. "I've been authorized to offer you a transfer, a position at a larger base with better facilities, a place where your work would have more visibility." David looked at Sanders, then shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I'd like to stay here. These soldiers need someone who knows them, who understands what they've been through. I'm not done yet." Sanders studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I thought you might say that too. All right, Chaplain, you're staying, but I want you to know you've made a difference here, more than you realize." That evening, David stood outside the chapel, watching the sun set over the desert. The wind was cool for once, carrying the faint smell of rain from distant mountains. He thought about Naomi and Daisy, his wife and daughter who had died years ago in a car accident, the loss that had nearly broken him. He thought about the long journey that had brought him here, to this dusty base in the middle of nowhere. He thought about Major Brennan, a man consumed by pride and fear, and he prayed for him. Not because Brennan deserved it, but because David believed everyone deserved grace, even those who had none to give. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind him. David turned to see Private Emily Chen approaching, her face illuminated by the fading light. "Chaplain," she said, her voice soft, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything, for listening, for standing up, for not leaving when things got hard." David smiled. "You don't have to thank me, Emily. That's my job." "It's more than a job," she replied. "You showed us what it means to have courage, not the kind that comes with a rifle, but the kind that comes from the heart." She handed him a folded piece of paper, then turned and walked back toward the barracks. David opened the paper and read the words written in careful handwriting. "The chaplain taught us that strength isn't just about fighting. It's about standing up for what's right, even when everyone tells you to sit down. He saved us in ways we didn't even know we needed saving." David folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. He looked up at the sky. now streaked with shades of orange and purple, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. The war would continue. The challenges would remain. But for now, in this small corner of the world, there was light. And as long as David Hayes stood in that chapel, as long as he refused to let fear and cruelty win, the light would remain. He turned and walked back inside, the door of the chapel closing softly behind him. The lantern flickered on, casting its warm glow into the gathering darkness, a beacon for all who needed refuge, comfort, and hope. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act with integrity when everything is on the line. Chaplain David Hayes proved that the strongest armor we can wear is built not from steel, but from faith, compassion, and the unshakable conviction that every life is worth defending, even at great personal cost.